Welcome back to CBSN and our continuing coverage of the 2016 Republican National Convention. Well, it was just about 24 hours or so ago that news was breaking that there were some accusations being talked about regarding Melania Trump's speech and whether portions of that speech had in fact been lifted from a speech that Michelle Obama gave in 2008. Our Nancy Cordes has been talking to her sources on this issue. And just to kind of put a button on this is something that we heard a lot about over the last 24 hours. People have been comparing the two, and there certainly were some similarities. What is it that you have found out about how that speech happened? How did that actually come about?
So what we have learned is that a draft of this speech was actually handed over to the campaign more than a month ago by the two outside speechwriters who had been hired to write it. These are two well-known conservative speechwriters. They've worked in various Republican administrations, worked on Sarah Palin's address, very well received back in 2008 at the Republican convention. And then they didn't really hear much about it from the Trump campaign. They were told that the campaign liked the speech, and that was about it. What Melania Trump delivered last night resembled almost nothing of that original draft. There was just a couple of snippets of that original speech that ended up in the address that she gave last night. And so what is unclear right now is who tinkered with it in the meantime. Was it Melania Trump? Was it an overeager staffer at the campaign? Who decided to basically rip up the speech that was written by a couple of professionals and start over again? The Trump campaign has not been very forthcoming about this. In fact, it's basically been radio silence ever since this morning when you had the campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, going on a variety of television shows, including CBS this morning, and doing a press conference to say, this wasn't plagiarism. You're crazy to think that Melania Trump would do something like this in the biggest speech of her life, and we completely reject the notion that these words were lifted from a different address. These are common themes of respect and love and doing the right thing, and you all are really making too much of it. Now, he didn't get a ton of backup from Republican officials who basically said, look, this was plagiarism, we should acknowledge what it was, fire somebody and move on, but that has not been the stance to this point of the Trump campaign.
Just to be clear, Nancy, those portions of the speech in question, were those portions part of the original draft that went to the Trump campaign a month ago?
They were not. They were not in the original version. And to this point, the Trump campaign hasn't said how they got in there. Initially, Melania Trump herself said that she was the primary author of that speech, but we've now gotten a lot of conflicting stories because we now know that A, a version was written by outside speechwriters, and B, campaign insiders have indicated that actually there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So we don't know who was responsible, but I should say that I've spoken to a number of speechwriters at this point from outside the campaign, and they all say, you know what, there is very inexpensive software that campaigns, that politicians use, that they run speeches through, that will tell you whether there are suspect passages that are popping up that have been used before in other places. And they're sort of mystified as to why a presidential campaign, the Trump campaign, wouldn't have used this software that is readily available and widely known about.
So, Steve, I guess the question is, does this matter to voters?
Well, I don't know if it matters to voters, but what it matters to is the fact that this is the convention. It's a 4-day convention. We've now spent the first 2 days talking about something that has nothing to do with what they're trying to sell to the American people, which is a message and a candidate. What we've talked about is a couple of paragraphs in a speech by the wife of the nominee. And that's not the message that you're trying to push forward. You want to be able to tell people this is what Donald Trump's going to do, this is what his opponent's not going to do, and we're not hearing any of that. All we're hearing about is plagiarism, right? So ultimately, it's a distraction, and ultimately, it's a waste, at least of the first day of their message, and we'll see if it's going to be a waste of their second day of their message. I mean, at some point, we'll move on from this. At some point, likely probably with Mike Pence's speech, and then definitely with Donald Trump's speech. But you've taken a 4-day event and you basically lopped off 2 days of messaging. that's been overshadowed by a plagiarism scandal.
And the problem is that it feeds into a concern that a lot of Republican donors in particular have about this campaign, which is that it's not ready for prime time, that it is not up to the task of a presidential campaign, that it's got a skeleton staff compared to the Clinton campaign, that a lot of people who are on this campaign haven't been involved in campaigns in the past, and they don't understand the complexity of what they are about to undertake. Does it matter to Republican voters? It doesn't matter to the people who are in this room. I've talked to a number of delegates, and they've all basically said the same thing, which is, who cares? This is being blown way out of proportion. This is much ado about nothing. These are common words that every wife of a presidential candidate would use. Let's get past it. But there are going to be voters in the country who already have concerns about Trump's truthfulness, about his ability to do a job like this with demands that have never been put upon him before, and and this may feed into that notion.
And to your point about the staffing and donors, I mean, this is the first real sort of major bungle by Paul Manafort since he's taken over as campaign manager. I think the idea that they got rid of Corey Lewandowski, the original campaign manager, that was a sale to donors and the establishment to say, okay, look, now we got the professionals in this joint running this place, and we're not going to have the kinds of mistakes that Donald Trump was making all throughout the primaries, going off message. And then this happens. So that must you gotta figure there's a bit of confidence being lost among the people they're trying to get behind as they pivot toward a general election.
And guess what helped to bring Hillary Clinton down in 2007 and 2008? It was infighting within her campaign. It was problems between managers about what the right path was, about access to the candidate. And when you had all that infighting, you really couldn't come out with a clear message.
Right.
Well, you had Corey Lewandowski today, the former campaign manager who was fired himself by Donald Trump, saying Paul Manafort should be fired because the buck stops here. Obviously, these two have some scores to settle because it's widely known that Corey Lewandowski and Paul Manafort clashed over a number of things, and clearly they are still clashing through the press, and it just further creates this image of a campaign that can't get out of its own way.
Right, and voters, again, don't care about this, but if you have a candidate who clearly needs some coaching, some discipline, and a clear message, to have all this chaos going on behind the scenes, that really can be problematic. And I think that's the point we're trying to make here, is the voters don't care about any of this, but if it results in the candidate not being a good candidate, then that's a problem.
Especially when this candidate is claiming that his central qualification for being president is that he's a great businessman and a great manager.
He'll get smart people.
And he'll get smart people, and he will run his campaign well. And then when you sort of see all this dirty laundry spilling out, it kind of counters that argument.
Certainly does make you wonder what might be just around the corner. Who knows?